The insult was still hanging in the air when the heavy steel door blasted open. I stepped out alone, uninjured, breathing steady. My tactical gloves were as clean as if I hadn't touched a single trap in the kill zone. The entire elite team froze. They all knew nobody crossed that live fire range without losing blood, limbs, or their sanity. My commander stared at me like he was witnessing a classified phenomenon. He couldn't comprehend how someone they expected to die in under 30 seconds had just walked back inside in perfect calm. Only a few minutes earlier, they had locked that door behind me. They had altered my digital map, boosted the sensitivity on the proximity mines, and convinced themselves they'd never see me again. They never realized they were sending me back into the one environment I had already survived long before they ever tried to test me. It all started 3 weeks prior, the morning I showed up at the Coronado Naval Base. I was wearing a plain gray t-shirt, black cargo pants that looked 2 years old, and boots so thoroughly broken in they barely made a sound on the asphalt grinder. No makeup, my hair pulled back with a simple rubber band, no watch, no jewelry, nothing that screamed money, status, or rank. I just carried a small black duffel bag over one shoulder and kept my eyes fixed ahead, never looking around for approval. The rest of the new selection class had arrived with fresh, high and tight haircuts, expensive tactical sunglasses, and that loud, aggressive confidence guys put on when they are scared to death. I looked like I had simply wandered in off the street. The morning air was thick with the scent of salt water and the nervous sweat of ambition. 74 young men, all boasting immaculate military records and physiques honed to lethal perfection, stood in rigid formation. Their new uniforms were pristine. They shuffled their weight, adjusted their heavy packs, and subtly checked the shine on their boots. I stood slightly apart from the group. It wasn't by design. I just occupied a completely different mental space. My stillness was profound, a total vacuum in the high-frequency tension rippling through the platoon. I didn't fidget. I didn't even blink unnecessarily. While the others were visibly performing readiness, I simply was ready. My plain gray shirt, faded from too many laundry cycles, drew every eye precisely because it was the only thing not demanding attention. It was the quiet 0 point against which all their chaotic kinetic energy was measured. That contrast was finally starting to register on the periphery of the veteran team watching us from the shadows. The quiet intensity I projected was unsettling to them. It was like watching a predator that hadn't twitched yet, but whose lethal potential was undeniable. This unit was arguably the most efficient and dangerous team on the West Coast, and they were waiting for me to make the first move. Their collective mood was heavy with disdain. They had seen my thin file, noticed the mysterious high-level waiver, realized my lack of conventional military background, and immediately drew their own conclusions. A political stunt. The idea that an unassuming woman who looked barely old enough to rent a car was being placed among them felt like a direct insult to their years of blood and dedication. Marcus, the team's communications specialist, stood with his arms crossed tight enough to bruise his biceps, his gaze fixed hard on my motionless posture. He'd seen men twice my size crack on day one, and he was eagerly anticipating a satisfying collapse. To him, I represented everything soft and compromised about modern military standards. The entire veteran unit was a coiled spring of resentment, waiting for their commander to deliver the verbal hammer blow that would shatter my false composure and send me running for the nearest administrative exit. The quiet hum of the naval base and the distant roar of a transport plane faded into background noise. The only sound that mattered now was the one the commander was about to make. Commander Vance was waiting on the quarterdeck with the rest of his team clustered behind him like a pack of wolves. Vance was 38, built like a concrete wall, and famous for detesting anything that smelled like favoritism. When I stopped directly in front of him and rendered a textbook salute, he didn't return it. He just let his eyes crawl slowly from my worn boots up to my face. Then, loud enough for every recruit on the grinder to hear, he barked, "You're lost, sweetheart. The USO hospitality desk is down the road." When that insult, crude, calculated, and designed to burn, was flung across the deck. The effect on the surrounding recruits was immediate. A collective held breath rippled through the ranks. But my expression didn't change. It wasn't stoicism, which implied an internal effort to fight back emotion. It was total absence. I didn't absorb the insult. I didn't even acknowledge it as relevant data. The psychological heat Vance intended to generate hit a complete void and dissipated, leaving his words hanging in the air, suddenly sounding incredibly small and petty against the vast, empty space of my composure. I lowered my salute with the slow, almost ceremonial precision of someone concluding a formal duty. My gaze remained unwavering, not defiant, but simply present. I didn't challenge him, I didn't drop my eyes, and I didn't offer the slightest physical tell that the insult had even registered in my brain. This total lack of reaction was paradoxically the most aggressive response possible. It instantly unnerved men who relied entirely on predictable psychological triggers. A couple of the veteran team members snickered in the background. Brody, the team's senior sniper, tall, blonde, and always chewing gum, leaned over to his teammate, Sarah, and muttered, "Looks like she's wearing extra small armor. What is this? Bring your little sister to work day?" Sarah, possessing sharp cheekbones and an even sharper tongue, laughed quietly through her nose. "Those boots are newer than her resume, I bet." I didn't flinch. I just locked my hands behind my back and waited. That kind of silence makes people incredibly nervous. Brody, accustomed to establishing dominance through verbal assault, felt the strange sensation of his own mockery stalling out. His whispered comments usually drew immediate laughter from the guys, creating a shared moment of superiority. This time, the laughter felt forced, hollowed out by my silence. He straightened up, shoving his hands into his pockets, his chewing gum snapping sharply in the sudden quiet. He felt a sudden, urgent need to re-establish the hierarchy that I was unknowingly dismantling simply by existing. He gave me a slow, exaggerated once-over, letting his eyes linger on the frayed fabric of my duffel bag, a deliberate violation of personal space. Commander Vance still hadn't moved, seemingly waiting for me to break my posture. The tension became a physical weight pressing down on the hot asphalt. Finally, Vance flicked my orders folder against his thigh. "Kepler," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "The file says you have 0 prior service. How exactly did you manage to graduate from a selection course with a 97% attrition rate?" I answered him in a voice so calm it felt refrigerated. "I finished it, sir." The system began testing me the moment the official gear issue started. It wasn't a casual prank. It was a layered, deliberate attempt to isolate me and engineer a physical failure. When I inspected my kit in the barracks, the signs of sabotage were subtle but undeniable. The tactical vest had a vital buckle that had been shaved down to slip under heavy load. The respirator mask for the diving drills had a microscopic hairline fracture along the rubber seal, placed precisely where high-pressure moisture would force it open mid-dive. Even my field binoculars had been tampered with. The internal prism was fractionally misaligned, just enough to induce severe vertigo during a prolonged observation detail. I didn't report it. I didn't complain, and I didn't ask the supply clerk for replacements. To do so would be playing into their script. Instead, during our brief evening maintenance window, I sat on the edge of my cot and quietly went to work. Using nothing more than the blade of my pocket knife and a length of utility wire I had salvaged from a discarded packing crate, I began re-engineering the gear. I reinforced the compromised buckle, sealed the respirator fracture with a field-expedient adhesive compound, and manually reset the optic prism by tracking a fixed star through the window until the crosshairs aligned flawlessly. Brody watched me from across the squad bay, his jaw clenched as he realized his subtle traps weren't producing the panic he wanted. My refusal to ask for help infuriated him. To the team, self-sufficiency looked like arrogance, because it meant I didn't trust the system they spent their lives serving. They didn't understand that maintaining zero trust was the very foundation of my training. The true physical gauntlet began at 0400 the next morning with a 4-mile timed swim. It was February, and the Pacific waters off Coronado were hovering near freezing. A brutal, muscle-cramping ordeal the instructors gleefully called the baptism. When we hit the surf, the men around me panicked. They attacked the black water with desperate, thrashing strokes, driven by a surge of adrenaline and raw terror. I took a different approach. I slipped into the swell and adopted a low-profile, highly efficient combat side stroke. I didn't try to lead the pack, but I didn't falter either. I kept my breathing rhythmic, keeping my core temperature locked. Halfway through the course, the chaos caught up to us. A recruit a few yards to my left succumbed to sudden hypothermia. His stroke failed, and his frantic cries were instantly swallowed by a heavy rolling wave as he began to sink. Without a word, I broke my line, dove beneath the swell, and secured him with my rescue tether. Hooking his weight to my belt, I turned back into the current and kept swimming, towing his unconscious body toward the safety boat. My pace barely dropped below the minimum passing standard. When I finally reached the extraction point, I unhooked the recruit, handed him off to the medics, and climbed out of the surf completely unassisted. I stood on the wet sand, shivering only slightly less than the men around me, my face totally devoid of dramatic exhaustion. Commander Vance stared at the medics treating the frozen recruit, then looked over at me as I casually queued up for the next physical assessment line. I could see the frustration burning in his eyes. I was utterly denying him the satisfaction of seeing me break. They tried brute force next during the log physical training drills. Teams of 10 were forced to hoist massive, waterlogged telephone poles, carrying them over soft sand dunes until our shoulders were reduced to raw pulp. Brody saw his chance. Using the chaotic movement of the exercise, he and the guy next to him subtly shifted their grip, tilting the telephone pole to ensure that my position, the designated killer end, carried a massive, disproportionate share of the weight. With every synchronized grunt and movement call, they pushed more torque directly onto my side. The muscles in my neck and shoulders coiled like steel cables under my wet t-shirt. My knuckles turned stark white against the rough, splintered wood. I didn't utter a single complaint, and I didn't let the log drop. Instead, during a sharp, shouted transition command from the instructor, I executed a microscopic shift in my stance and body angle. It was a fractional leverage adjustment, using pure physics to redistribute the entire load back across the center of the team. Instantly, my impossible burden vanished. Brody let out an unexpected grunt of surprise as the massive weight snapped back onto his side, forcing him to strain harder than he had all morning. He glanced over at me, his face turning red as I maintained the same steady, unnerving pace. He hadn't just failed to sabotage me. He had been beaten at his own game using basic mechanics, and it was a massive blow to his sense of physical dominance. Realizing brute force wouldn't work, Sarah tried a more intellectual trap during our first night land navigation exercise. She spent an hour in the staging area secretly doctoring my assigned compass, introducing a subtle magnetic deviation into the casing. In a fast-paced exercise requiring blind trust in your instruments, that error was designed to steer a novice directly into a restricted, hazardous marshland, resulting in an immediate safety failure. I set off into the pitch-black terrain using only my internal stride count and the compromised compass. In the command trailer, the team hovered around the monitor, tracking the secret GPS beacon they had sewn into my pack, waiting for me to veer into the swamp. For the first mile, my trackers showed me walking the exact trajectory they expected. Then, suddenly, I cut a sharp 30-degree angle to the left, completely bypassing the hazard and navigating the high ground instead. When I crossed the finish line with a perfect score, an infuriated Vance cornered me, demanding to know how I had navigated the course. I didn't say a word. I just unhooked my compass and handed it to him. On the inside of the glass casing, I had rubbed a microscopic line of charcoal dust before setting out. It was an old field trick to detect minute, localized magnetic interference by watching the needle's physical friction against the housing. I had never trusted their issued gear to begin with. The moment I noticed the hitch, I threw the compass tracking out the window, recalibrated my route using the North Star, and completed the course on pure terrain association. Sarah looked at the charcoal dust on the lens, her face pale with humiliation. Her complex electronic sabotage had been entirely neutralized by a piece of soot. The psychological warfare escalated rapidly after that. They realized physical exhaustion and gear manipulation weren't triggering the standard breaking points, so they shifted the attack to my emotional armor. Marcus was convinced I was using performance-enhancing chemicals to maintain my impossibly flat heart rate, going so far as to demand a secret blood draw from the team medic, Dr. Vane. When the labs came back entirely clean, showing nothing but an incredibly efficient oxygen saturation and a boringly low resting pulse, their frustration turned to pure resentment. I was forcing them to confront a reality they hated. I wasn't cheating the system, I was simply built for it. Brody tried to mask his growing unease with relentless sarcasm, calling me princess at every formation, deliberately kicking sand across my weapons assembly during maintenance windows, and trying to infantilize my presence. He wanted a reaction, a shout, a tear, a defensive spark. Instead, I would simply pull a clean cotton handkerchief from my pocket, spend a meticulous minute restoring the rifle's bolt carrier group to absolute readiness, and step right back into the line without ever looking up. When insults failed, they turned to terror. One night, the tent flap tore open at 0200. I was dragged violently from my cot by a mock capture team, a black hood thrown over my head, and hauled into a concrete bunker for a staged interrogation drill. They didn't just use the standard yelling and bright lights. They brought in industrial infrasound generators designed to emit low-frequency vibrations that trigger instinctive, biological panic and nausea in the human body. They kept me under the strobes and the hum for 4 hours, waiting for the mask to slip. But my training hadn't just taught me how to endure panic. It taught me how to treat fear as raw data. In the control room, Marcus watched the biometric telemetry feeds in disbelief. My heart rate didn't spike. Instead, I utilized a specialized autonomic override, a precise breathing pattern that shunts blood flow away from the extremities and lowers core demands, effectively counter-programming the physical effects of the sound waves. When the lights finally came up and the hood was yanked off, I didn't shake. I looked Vance dead in the eye, adjusted the collar of my standard sleep shirt, and delivered a dry, clinical assessment of the room's setup. I cataloged the exact frequency range of their generators, the cycle speed of the strobe lights, and the precise number of distinct vocal patterns I had tracked in the dark. I suppressed the emotional response simply to preserve cognitive processing power for data acquisition. Vance sat back, his jaw tight. It was the exact moment they realized they weren't dealing with a person they could break, but an operating system they couldn't hack. Determined to find a vulnerability, Marcus decided to test my technical knowledge on his own turf. He handed me a highly complex, custom-encrypted communications key that he had spent an hour deliberately breaking with a deep, non-obvious logical error. He gave me a 5-minute deadline to debug the script before the system hard-locked. I didn't touch the keyboard. For the first 2 minutes, I just stood there, my eyes tracing the recursive loops of code projected on the wall. At the 3-minute mark, I reached out, pointed to a single line buried deep within a nested function, and told him exactly where the Stack Overflow was hiding. The loop condition used an inclusive boundary, causing an off-by-1 error on the final iteration. I hadn't even run the debugger. It was pure instantaneous pattern recognition. Sarah tried a different angle, hunting for a personal history she could leverage. She noticed my file was completely blank before selection. No emergency contacts, no family records, no letters arriving at mail call. One afternoon, she casually dropped a tablet on the workbench in front of me, showing a front-page article about a massive political corruption scandal involving a high-ranking defense official and a disgraced intelligence operative. She stood there, watching my eyes for a flicker of recognition, a sign of family ties, or a past loyalty she could exploit. I looked at the grainy arrest photo for exactly 2 seconds. Then I picked up my nylon cleaning brush and went right back to scrubbing the carbon off my firing pin. I didn't deny the connection, I didn't confirm it, and I didn't give her the satisfaction of a defensive glance. I treated the invasive information exactly like the sand Brody had kicked onto my rifle, an external variable to be observed, categorized, and dismissed as irrelevant to the current objective. Sarah picked up her tablet and walked away in absolute silence. The realization was finally settling in across the entire unit. My past was buried in a place far too deep and dangerous for any of them to dig. The decision to throw me into the live-fire dead zone wasn't born out of a desire for legitimate evaluation. It was driven by pure, petulant exhaustion. Vance gathered the veteran team in the ready room, the heavy steel doors shut tight. Nora, the quiet technical specialist who managed the live fire ranges, stood back in the corner, her posture tense and uneasy. Vance tossed an old, worn paper map onto the metal table. "The range opens at 0600, he said, his voice flat and unyielding. 15 minutes solo insertion. You walk out of that kill zone breathing, Kepler. You stay on this team. You don't, well, the roster resolves itself." Brody let out a wide, eager grin, tossing a $20 bill onto the table. "I bet she doesn't last 4 minutes. Sarah was already typing furiously on her tablet, adjusting the range parameters. Nora finally spoke up, her voice low and laced with genuine concern. "Commander, you can't greenlight this. The red flag isn't just for live ordnance this month. There's non-standardized chemical residue left over from the last agency exercise, and containment protocols are incomplete. 15 minutes of exposure will cause permanent organ damage, even if she manages to bypass the active traps." Vance silenced her with a brutal, cold glare. "Your job is to monitor the telemetry feeds, Quinn, not critique my mission parameters. I'm giving the recruit the ultimate opportunity to prove she belongs here. Stand down." Nora retreated into the shadows of the console, but her fingers flew across her keyboard, quietly bypassing the standard Bravo 9 network to open a secondary, independent monitoring line. It was a clear act of insubordination, one that could cost her her career, but she did it anyway. They handed me the map with half the grid legend intentionally scratched out, a heavy tactical flashlight missing its batteries, and a field radio they knew wouldn't transmit past the first ridge line. As I prepped my gear, Brody walked up and clapped me hard on the shoulder, a heavy blow meant to stagger a normal recruit. "Good luck, Princess. Try not to trip over your own feet out there." It was a final, petty attempt at physical sabotage. Hidden in his palm was a small, heavily weighted lead disc. Under the guise of that encouraging slap, he deftly slipped the weight into the outer cargo pocket of my pants. The extra half-pound was negligible, nearly impossible to detect against the weight of a tactical knife and field kit, but it was precisely engineered to throw off my center of gravity just enough to cause a fatal micro-error during a dynamic jump or a fast cornering maneuver. I didn't flinch. I just looked down at his hand on my shoulder until he slowly pulled it away. I gave him a single, brief nod, turned, and walked toward the heavy staging gates. The moment I reached the threshold, I smoothly reached into my pocket, extracted the lead disc with 2 fingers, and without breaking stride, flicked it out into the dense brush. The weight landed with a dull, heavy thud, exactly where the range's first pressure plate mine was concealed. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind me, locking with a final, echoing metallic thud. Inside the control bunker, an expectant, toxic silence took hold. The team huddled around the monitors, sipping their coffee with forced indifference, but their eyes were glued to the black and white camera feeds. They weren't betting on whether I would fail, but how fast and spectacular the crash would be. Sarah kept running predictive failure models on her tablet, plugging in my entry speed and the known trap density. The screen kept flashing an impossibility, a 99.99% survival probability if my current velocity was maintained. She kept aggressively refreshing the interface, entirely convinced the algorithm was broken, unable to accept that the system was simply telling her the truth. Inside the zone, the morning air felt heavy, but I moved through the terrain like it was empty space. I hit the first pressure plate within 90 seconds. I heard the faint, mechanical click beneath the soil a fraction of a second before my boot fully settled. Instantly, I dropped to one knee, untied my left bootlace, and looped it securely around a thick, sturdy root nearby. I slid the root smoothly under my foot to hold the trigger mechanism down, maintaining the exact pressure requirement, and slid my foot free. The mine remained completely silent. On the control room monitors, the camera feed glitched for a split second as I bypassed the sensor. Sarah cursed quietly under her breath. Next came the collapsed trench, a pit hidden beneath a flawless layer of loose pine needles, designed to catch a recruit mid-stride and force a catastrophic fall. Moving at a silent, gliding pace, I didn't just walk blind. I used the flat of my tactical knife to execute a rapid sequence of micro-percussions against the earth, listening to the acoustic resonance. The hollow thud gave me the exact boundary of the hidden frame. Instead of scrambling backward, I utilized an explosive vertical bound, clearing the entire hazard and landing in a feather-light roll that absorbed every ounce of kinetic energy. My boots didn't displace a single needle on the perimeter lip. The ground-level camera captured the fluid, near-impossible movement, a display of structural physics that kept Brody's $20 bill hanging uselessly in his hand. I caught the next trap by the way the early morning light bent wrong through the brush. A single strand of monofilament line was stretched taut at ankle height across a narrow choke point, wired directly to a concussion grenade detonator. It was a classic stress trap, designed for an operator whose focus was glued to the ground rather than the space around them. Instead of backing away, I noticed the minuscule geometric distortion the wire caused in the dew-coated spiderwebs hanging from the low branches. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the short, precisely cut length of utility wire I'd salvaged days ago during my gear repairs. I didn't try to pull the pin or disarm the setup conventionally. Instead, I used the wire as a micro-tool, gently bending the safety lever just enough to afford a fraction of an inch of slack. I stepped cleanly over the line without triggering the required tension change, leaving the mechanism fully intact but completely bypassed. In the control room, Sarah's mouth actually drifted open. Then the range's thermal grid spun up, the high-velocity dart blades whirring into motion. The automated system was calibrated to fire non-lethal, high-velocity darts at any heat signature rising above the ambient room temperature. To beat it, I didn't just suppress my adrenaline. I forced a total autonomic plunge. Using a specific deep-diving apnea breathing technique combined with internal muscular control, I shunted my blood flow away from my extremities, creating a diffused, fractured thermal pattern across my skin. On Vance's monitors, my heat signature didn't just drop. It scattered across the screen like static background noise. The sensors couldn't lock onto a cohesive target. I walked right through the center of the killing arc at a steady, measured pace, the darts firing harmlessly into the empty air millimeters behind my heels. Vance didn't even lift his coffee cup to his mouth. He slammed the mug down onto the console so hard the liquid splashed across the deck, his face a portrait of absolute, uncomprehending shock. The final obstacle was the deep, collapsed trench. The moment my weight shifted near the edge, the engineered soil gave way in a calculated, sliding crumble, designed to pull a target down into a slow, trapping descent. Most people would have panicked or screamed on the way down. I didn't wait to hit the bottom. The exact millisecond the dirt began to give, before the main structure failed, I released my custom-modified titanium spike from my belt. I fired it upward, anchoring it into a narrow fissure in the granite cliff face above. Skipping the dramatic cinematic swing, I executed a pure, rigid vertical pull-up, pinning my body parallel to the collapsing wall and using the friction of my boots against the stone purely for stability. I hauled myself over the lip of the trench in a single, controlled expenditure of energy. The entire escape took less than 2 seconds. When I stood back up on solid ground, the only proof of the exertion was the faint dusting of white chalk on my hands where I had gripped the line. I brushed the dirt from my sleeves, looked directly into the lens of a hidden security camera they thought I didn't know about, and began the short walk toward the exit gate. Exactly 15 minutes had elapsed. When the heavy steel door blasted open, I stood in the morning light, my clothes barely dusty, looking as relaxed as if I had just walked down the driveway to grab the morning mail. The control room descended into a dead, suffocating silence. Marcus's $20 bill slipped from his fingers and fluttered uselessly to the floor. Sarah took a sharp step backward, bumping hard into her empty chair. Vance stood rigid, his chest heaving slightly, as if the floor had just tilted beneath his boots. Only Nora let out a long, slow breath she'd been holding for a quarter of an hour. Marcus was the first to break the quiet, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to yell. "Somebody walked her through the grid. There's no way!" Sarah spun her tablet around, her fingers shaking as she pointed at the interface. "Look at the data. The main telemetry feeds experienced a localized cutout right when she entered the second sector. She cheated the sensors." Vance slammed both hands onto the metal table, the echo rattling the equipment racks. "Nobody walks the dead zone clean. Nobody." I simply stood outside the threshold, my hands clasped loosely behind my back, waiting for them to finish their denial. When Vance finally marched out and demanded an explanation, I gave him the only truth that mattered. "I trained for it, sir." The silence in that room wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of an entire operational philosophy fracturing. Vance's hands stayed pressed against the metal table, his knuckles turning white as he stared through the glass at me. For a man who had built his entire reputation on the predictable breaking points of human endurance, my existence was a direct threat. If I could walk through his ultimate gauntlet without breaking a sweat, it meant the limits he had spent his life enforcing were completely arbitrary. Brody picked up his fallen $20 bill, his usual cocky grin entirely gone. He looked genuinely rattled, staring at the telemetry screens as if he were trying to find a glitch in the laws of physics. He kept glancing from the monitors to the door, his jaw working silently. He had spent years defining his worth by his physical dominance over every recruit who entered this base, and a 5'6" woman in a faded t-shirt had just turned his playground into a joke. Sarah was frantic, her fingers flying across her tablet as she tried to pull up the raw system logs. "The grid sensitivity was maxed out," she muttered, her voice dropping into a desperate, defensive register. The environmental sensors didn't even register a localized spike in humidity when she cleared the trench. The predictive model is still running a loop because the input data doesn't match the physical constraints of the course. She wasn't just trying to prove I cheated. She was trying to save her own ego. If her data models couldn't predict my movements, it meant her intellectual superiority was just as useless as Brody's brute force. Only Nora remained perfectly still in the corner, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching the edge of her mouth. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She closed out her secondary monitoring feed, scrubbing the encryption key from her terminal before Vance could look her way. She had given them their warning. They had ignored it. And now they had to swallow the result. They didn't believe me. They couldn't. To accept that I had simply trained for it meant admitting that their entire selection process was obsolete, an outdated relic compared to whatever ghost program had produced me. So, instead of adapting, they doubled down on their resentment, retreating into the toxic certainty that if the system couldn't break me, they would just have to break the system. The final deployment orders came down exactly a week later. It was a real-world hostage rescue in a high-threat hot zone, an operation with absolutely zero margin for error. The atmosphere in the staging bay the night before the drop was brittle and poisoned. Vance had doubled down on his hostility, not out of operational confidence, but out of a desperate, clawing need to reclaim his fractured authority. When he gave me the final mission brief, he assigned me to the rear security detail, miles away from the primary target area. He didn't even look me in the eye when he delivered the order, using a tone of heavy finality to convince himself he was simply keeping an unpredictable political liability out of the real fight. But Brody and Sarah weren't content with just sidelining me. They executed their sabotage with cold, surgical precision in the dark corners of the equipment shack, exchanging a single, grim nod when the modifications were complete. Brody quietly accessed my field GPS, and swapped the preloaded grid coordinates, ensuring that the route marked as a safe extraction corridor would actually funnel me directly into a heavily fortified enemy kill sack. Simultaneously, Sarah loaded my tactical observation drone with a depleted battery she knew would die within 20 minutes of launch, while handing me an old, outdated field radio tuned to a frequency they had already abandoned. They weren't just trying to humiliate me anymore. They were actively executing a lethal cover-up. They treated my very existence as an inconvenient loose end that needed to be permanently severed before it completely destroyed their professional reputations. The next morning, as the transport helicopter lifted off the tarmac, the team members stared straight ahead, entirely avoiding my gaze. A collective, heavy silence hung in the cabin, a mute indictment of their calculated betrayal. The insertion into the target sector went smoothly, but the transition from routine patrol to total chaos was instantaneous. The enemy ambush hit us with terrifying textbook efficiency, precisely where Brody's doctored coordinates had directed the team. We were funneled directly into the center of the kill sack. The world turned into a deafening roar of automatic weapons fire and the sickening rhythmic thump of incoming mortars. Our communications network dissolved into immediate static. The tactical drone sputtered, lost power, and dropped out of the sky like a stone. Within 90 seconds, the entire unit, the supposed pinnacle of elite operational excellence, found itself pinned down behind crumbling stone walls, disoriented, and taking heavy casualties. Vance was screaming into his dead radio for an extraction that wasn't coming, his face twisted in raw terror as the horror of his own hubris caught up to him. They weren't dying because the enemy was superior. They were dying because his own team had engineered their own trap. For several heart-stopping seconds, the fight was pure, one-sided slaughter. Then, the momentum of the battle shifted almost imperceptibly. The heavy machine gun position on the ridge above us was silenced not by a lucky mortar strike, but by 3 precise, subsonic thumps. The rounds were fired from a distance and an angle that Vance hadn't even bothered to secure, impacting the enemy gunners with surgical accuracy. It was the distinct acoustic signature of a custom-calibrated rifle firing far beyond its conventional ballistic range. Suddenly, I stepped out of the swirling smoke, dragging a badly wounded teammate with one hand while using my free arm to shove Vance behind a deep rock defilade, a fraction of a second before a heavy round shattered the stone where his head had been. Working entirely on instinct, I pulled a small broken mirror fragment from my utility kit and began stroking a high-powered laser across the rocky face opposite our position, painting false, flickering heat signatures that completely threw off the enemy's targeting sensors. With calm, unhurried movements, I took point and guided the limping, shell-shocked unit out through a narrow, unmapped mountain seam that the enemy hadn't secured. As we cleared the perimeter, I paused in the shadows, pointing the laser at a jagged piece of metal wreckage lodged in the cliffside. I pulsed a rapid, timed data burst off the fragment, a high-level, encrypted transmission sent directly to an overhead asset. Vance watched the silent data exchange, and I could see the final remaining floor of his reality completely give way. He realized then that my rear security assignment hadn't been a punishment at all. I was the ghost coordinate on the map. I was the ultimate failsafe, the direct command link to an external authority that had been monitoring the entire operation from the beginning. They hadn't been leading a mission. They had merely been acting as bait for a much larger, darker operational canvas, and I was the one holding the brush. We limped back to the Coronado base alive solely because of my intervention. The moment our boots hit the tarmac, the brittle illusion of their brotherhood shattered completely. Marcus was the first to vocalize his panic, his voice cracking through the ringing in his ears as the dust settled. "Who the hell is feeding her intel? Someone gave her the entire enemy layout before we even spun up the birds." Sarah huddled near the equipment lockers, her face pale, whispering to anyone who would listen. "She's got to be an agency plant. Look at the data. There is no logistical way she could have anticipated that flanking maneuver without a dedicated satellite link." Commander Vance, desperate to shield his own command from the catastrophic failure of the mission, immediately called for a formal security investigation. He signed the emergency paperwork before the medics could even patch his scratches, officially suspending me pending a full counterintelligence review. Two stone-faced military police officers stepped up to my side, their hands resting on their sidearms, and began walking me across the compound toward the brig. I didn't resist. I didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't look back at the team. I kept my pace steady, my hands clasped loosely at my sides. That was the exact moment every primary alarm across the entire naval base flipped to high alert red. The main gate security cameras caught a lone figure walking straight through the reinforced checkpoint. He was wearing clean, unmarked black utilities, completely devoid of name patches, rank insignia, or unit badges. He moved past the active biometric scanners like they didn't even exist, his stride possessing the exact same quiet, hyper-efficient economy of motion that the veteran team had spent 3 weeks trying to beat out of me. When he stepped out of the blinding noon sun and into the harsh fluorescent light of the command building, half the operators in the control room gasped, their coffee cups freezing halfway to their mouths. It was Silas Kincaid. Silas was a man declared killed in action 4 years prior during a classified operation in East Africa, a mission that officially never took place on any public record. The myth who wasn't supposed to be drawing breath walked directly into the ready room, bypassed the guards, and looked Vance dead in the eye. "You just suspended my student," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that completely filled the sudden silence of the room. He reached into his jacket and laid a matte black credential wallet flat on the metal table. The high encryption authorization code stamped beneath his name made the duty officer's face turn completely translucent. The veteran administrator's hand trembled so violently he had to rest his palm on the desk to keep the wallet from rattling against the steel. That specific code represented a level of unilateral clandestine authority that officially did not exist within the standard Department of Defense framework, certifying that the man standing before them operated entirely outside the conventional chain of command. Silas didn't raise his voice a single decibel. He just let his cold gaze sweep across the fractured unit. "She completed the Kincaid 7 protocol," he stated, the words falling like lead weights. "Your little dead zone range was nothing more than her morning warm-up. You thought you were running a standard hazing ritual to protect your fragile egos, but you actually just turned your entire deployment into a black protocol operational evaluation of Bravo 9. He paused, letting the reality of the situation sink into their expressions. "And you failed every single metric." The mention of the Kincaid 7 protocol hit the ready room like a physical shockwave. It wasn't a training course. It was a ghost designation whispered about in the darkest corners of the intelligence community. A program designed from the ground up to create flawless tactical assets whose sole purpose was the detection and elimination of systemic rot, arrogance, and operational decay within elite military units. The realization that they had been the targets of the assessment rather than the judges broke what was left of Vance's composure. His knees literally buckled, and he dropped heavily to the concrete floor right there in front of his men. It wasn't a dramatic gesture of submission. It was a total biological collapse under the weight of absolute professional ruin. The reputation he had spent 2 decades building on the concepts of raw merit and unyielding toughness was exposed as nothing more than a carefully managed fiction, dismantled effortlessly by the woman he had spent weeks calling a princess. Marcus's face went completely gray, his wide eyes staring blankly at the floor. He instinctively looked down at his own hands, the memory of slipping the weighted lead disc into my pocket now serving as the definitive, documented proof of his own petty malice. Sarah looked visually sick, the smug, intellectual certainty she had used as a shield completely evaporating, leaving behind nothing but the raw terror of unavoidable professional erasure. Silas reached out, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. "Let's go. They aren't ready for this level of capability." I turned toward the door, glancing back just once. I wasn't angry, and I didn't feel a single shred of triumph. My expression remained perfectly flat, as my eyes swept over Vance on the floor, the terrified Marcus, and the broken Sarah. "I gave them every opportunity," I said quietly. It wasn't a boast. It was a final, clinical assessment of their choice. I had given them every chance to exhibit standard military professionalism, to halt the escalating sabotage, and to simply execute their operational duties with integrity. They had chosen personal betrayal instead, and now the ledger was being balanced. I walked out of the command building beside the ghost who had built me, climbed into an unmarked black helicopter waiting on the pad, and lifted off into the cloud cover. The rhythmic, muffled thump of the rotor blades fading into the distance was the final sound of their established world coming to an absolute end. The administrative execution began at 0800 the following morning. Commander Vance was relieved of his command with surgical efficiency, the separation paperwork arriving already signed by authorities operating miles above the standard naval command structure. It wasn't a public court-martial. It was a total erasure, a silent excision from the active duty register that left no paper trail behind. Marcus's top-secret security clearance vanished from the network overnight, not officially revoked or suspended, but entirely scrubbed from every federal database, transforming him into a civilian with a highly suspicious, completely blank military history. His highly specialized skill set was rendered instantly useless. Sarah's lucrative private defense contracts dried up within the same week. Her tech consulting opportunities evaporated as every single one of her high-level military clients unilaterally terminated their agreements without explanation, signaling that her ethical failure was fully understood by the invisible hands controlling the industry. Her career didn't end with a spectacular scandal. It simply froze to a permanent, silent halt. Word of the incident traveled quickly and quietly through the deepest, most restricted tiers of the special operations community. The warning became standard doctrine among those who operated in the shadows. Never cross the operative who walked out of the live-fire dead zone clean. Men who had spent their entire lives believing they were the absolute pinnacle of human performance woke up to the chilling realization that they were merely the baseline test parameters all along. And somewhere out there in the unmapped sectors, I keep training the next generation. The ones who will never wear a traditional uniform and who will never need to explain their actions to a system they completely outpace.